The snow fell in sheets across the northern ridge, each flake a small death against her bare shoulders. Kyle had been cast out 3 days ago, not with ceremony, not with the ritual words that might have granted her mercy. Simply released into the white like a broken thing, her Omega scent stripped of rank, her name erased from the Pax Memoria. The arrow had been meant as mercy then, too, a clean end. She had not taken it. Instead, she had walked deeper into the mountains, where the peaks swallowed sound, and the wind carried no memory of Pax or kings. Her claws had dug into frozen earth, her teeth had torn at frozen hairs, and her heart, the traitor heart that had loved him in the darkness of the great hall, had continued to beat. Kale found shelter in a ravine where ancient stones formed a natural shelter, their surfaces marked with symbols so old they had begun to forget their own meaning. She collapsed there as dusk claimed the sky, her body trembling not from cold but from the severing, that psychic rupture when a wolf is cast from her pack. It felt like having her spine drawn out through her throat. The moon rose silver and merciless. She should have been afraid. An Omega alone in the winter territories was prey, and there were things that hunted in these heights that made even alphas cautious. But Kyle had learned something in her 23 years. Fear required hope to survive it. And hope had left her the moment she saw his eyes turn away. King Theron had not ordered her death himself. That would have required acknowledgement. Instead, he had simply allowed his generals to do what they pleased with the Omega who had spoken truth in the War Council, the Omega who had suggested mercy to a people already drowning in blood. They had called her weak, dangerous, a liability wearing a female face. The ravine's stones seemed to lean closer as night deepened. Kale pulled the tattered remains of her cloak, the only thing they had left her, and felt its silver threading catch the moonlight. Silver, the color of kings, the color of the one she could never touch. Her ribs ached where the arrow had nearly struck her down. They had been precise, the hunters. But her Omega instinct, that ancient, supposedly inferior sense, had made her pivot a half-second before release. The arrow had grazed her chest, drawn blood, left a mark that would scar. A mark that would always remind her that survival was not the same as salvation. She closed her eyes and listened to the wind sing through the stones. Somewhere in the darkness, wolves were hunting. Somewhere in the castle she had known all her life. King Theron sat in his great hall, drinking wine that cost more than her entire existence, and he did not think of her at all. The mountain held her as she bled quietly into the ancient snow. Theron was dying, though no one was permitted to notice. The arrow had found its mark 3 nights ago, not in the heart, but close enough. It had come from the eastern border, from enemies whose names he had stopped learning years ago. His generals wanted to march. His healers wanted to bleed him further. His court wanted him to appear in the great hall and pretend that a king's body was immune to mortal damage. He did none of these things. Instead, he rode north into the territories he had ordered sealed, the mountains where nothing human belonged. The wound beneath his armor had begun to rot from the inside, poisoned by whatever dark magic had coated the arrowhead. His wolf could smell his own decay. Soon his generals would smell it too, and then the vultures would descend. It was fitting, he supposed. A king who had ordered the slaughter of an entire village, a village that harbored a single enemy, deserved to rot. The horse beneath him was loyal, which made it worse. Loyalty was a weight he could no longer bear. Theron had not always been this way. There had been a time when his hands had been clean, or at least he had believed so. There had been a time when he had looked at his people and seen something worth protecting, rather than something that required managing. There had been a time when an Omega had stood in his war council and spoken of mercy, and instead of hearing weakness, he had ordered her removed, not killed. He could not quite stomach that, though he had convinced himself it was mercy. "Release her," he had said. "Give her the choice of the mountains or the slow death of exile." And when his generals had interpreted this as permission to hunt her, he had not corrected them. That was the wound that truly poisoned him. The ravine appeared before him like a scar in the earth, and Theron found himself descending into it without conscious decision. His wolf knew something his human mind had not yet admitted. He had been tracking her scent for 3 days, following the ghost of her omega musk through the snow, drawn by bonds he had refused to acknowledge when she lived in his castle. Bond mate. The word rose unbidden, and he rejected it with the force of rage. He was Alpha King of the Northern Territories. He did not have bondmates, he had consorts and political marriages and heirs. He did not have an Omega who had made him feel, for the first time in a decade, like his crown was choking him. And he certainly did not have one who loved him enough to nearly die for it. The shelter revealed itself slowly as his eyes adjusted to the darkness. Ancient stones, older than his dynasty, older perhaps than language itself. And there, wrapped in silver-threaded cloth that caught the moonlight like trapped stars, was her small, broken form. Kyle. Her name hit him like a second arrow, this one aimed at the last remaining piece of his soul that still insisted it was human. She was alive, scarred, bleeding still from a wound he recognized immediately. The arrow meant for him had found her instead. And she was unconscious, fever-bright, her breath coming in shallow pants that suggested infection. Theron's wolf screamed to claim her, to gather her up and carry her to safety, to undo every cruelty he had permitted in her name. His king held him still. For one long moment, the Alpha King, poisoned, dying, responsible for the very exile that had brought her here, simply knelt in the snow and looked at the Omega, who had learned to bleed in silence for him, and felt something inside his chest break open like a sealed tomb. The silver arrow that had been meant to end him lay in the snow beside her, its fletching stained with blood that was not his own. He could not leave her. This was the thought that consumed Theron as he built a fire from dead branches and wrapped her fever-broken body closer to its warmth. She did not wake. Her body thrashed through nightmares, calling out names he did not recognize. People from her life before the castle, he realized. The family she had been taken from, the Omega Pack she had belonged to before the king's hunters had selected her for the royal court. Before he had ruined everything. The infection in her wound had deepened. He cleaned it with snow and the last of his healing herbs, feeling the poison resist his touch. Dark magic, not the deep sorcery of gods, but something older, something that whispered of blood debt and deliberate cruelty. His generals had done this deliberately, choosing a way to kill that would be slow, that would break her spirit before it broke her body. He had allowed them to think this way. Theron's own wound was a secondary concern now, though the rot continued its patient work beneath his ribs. He could feel the darkness spreading through his veins, the way his wolf was growing quieter, more distant. The poison was winning. In another day, perhaps 2, his body would simply stop. But not yet. Not while she was still burning with fever, not while her blood continued to fight against the darkness that had been placed inside her. He sat through the night and watched her face, searching for some trace of the Omega he had known, the quiet one who had sat at the edge of the war councils, whose eyes had held judgment and compassion in equal measure. She had been dangerous to him, he understood now. Not because she was weak, but because she was strong in ways that his violence could not touch. She had looked at his cruelty and had not accepted it, so he had destroyed her for it. The irony was exquisite. In trying to remove the voice that questioned his kingship, he had made it eternal. Now it lived inside him. Now it was the only sound he could hear. As dawn broke gray and heavy across the ravine, Kale's fever spiked one final time. Her body went rigid, and Theron thought, with a clarity that felt like mercy, that this was the end. This was the mercy the mountains would grant her, a quick death instead of slow corruption. But then her back arched, and a sound emerged from her that was not quite human, not quite wolf. It was something older, something that made the symbols on the ancient stones seem to pulse with silver light, her Omega gift. Of course, the true reason they had cast her out, not because she had spoken mercy, but because she possessed something rare and dangerous, the Pathfinder's gift, the ability to read fates and futures, to see the threads of destiny that connected all living things. She had seen something in him worth saving, and so they had destroyed her for it. Theron gathered her closer as the silver light faded, as her fever broke and her breathing steadied. Her hand found his chest in sleep, her fingers pressing against the wound beneath his armor, and he felt, impossibly, the poison beginning to recede. An Omega's gift was not meant for healing. It was meant for seeing. But perhaps, in her love for him, she was rewriting the rules of what was possible. The mountains held them both as the day grew bright and the silver arrow lay forgotten in the snow. And now, I invite you to leave a trace of your presence in the comments. Tell us where in the world you're watching from and the exact hour you hear this story. We wish to know how far these northern confessions travel and at what moments of the night they find you. She woke to find herself alive, and for a moment this seemed like the greatest cruelty yet. Kale's eyes opened to gray light filtering through the shelter's opening, and she felt the fever's grip releasing her slowly, like a predator that had grown tired. Her body ached in the deep, all-consuming way that suggested she had hovered at death's threshold for some time. But the poison, the creeping darkness that had begun to crystallize in her veins, was receding, gone almost entirely. She turned her head and found him. The Alpha King was asleep against the far wall of the shelter, his breathing shallow and labored. In the gray light she could see what she should have seen before, the sickness that clung to him like a second skin, the way his hand pressed against his ribs as if trying to hold something in, the silver tint to his lips that spoke of poison still working through his blood. He was dying. Kyle sat up slowly, testing her limbs, finding them weak but functional. The silver arrow that had meant to kill her lay in the snow outside the shelter's entrance, a silent witness to whatever had transpired while she burned through her fever. She remembered fragments, his hands, rough and careful, cleaning her wound, his voice, low and urgent, speaking words she could not quite grasp, and beneath it all, the sensation of light, her own light, pouring from her chest into his, her Pathfinder's gift, the thing they had tried to burn out of her. It had not burned. Instead, it had simply learned to hide. Understanding settled over her like snow. She had used her gift while trapped in fever delirium. Not to see the future, that was the lesser part of a Pathfinder's power, a parlor trick for courtiers and fortune-tellers. She had used the deeper gift, the ability to walk the threads between destinies, to step into someone else's fate and pull them back from the abyss. She had walked into his dying and had chosen to stay. Now, watching him sleep with his hand pressed to his ribs, Kale felt the terrible weight of that choice settle into her bones. They had cast her out for this, not for suggesting mercy in war councils, though that was what they had told themselves. They had cast her out because they feared what an Omega with her gifts might do if she loved the wrong person, if she loved someone with enough power to destroy kingdoms, if she loved him. Theron's eyes opened suddenly, wolf-sharp and dangerous, before recognition softened them. For a moment, just a moment, he looked at her with something that was not pity, not regret. Something that looked like the first honest thing he had ever allowed himself to feel. "You should have let the fever take me," he said. His voice was rough, unused. "You walked into death for me. I felt it. Your light, your gift, walking through my darkness." "I know," Kyle said. She was surprised by how steady her own voice was. "I remember." "Why?" The question carried the weight of kingdoms. "I destroyed you. I ordered you removed from my court, from my pack, from the world I had built. And you... I saw something in you that you had not yet learned to destroy," she said. The words came from somewhere deeper than thought, from the pathfinder's gift that lived in her bones, that could read the true architecture of a person's soul. I saw a king who was drowning in blood that was never his to spill. I saw a wolf who had forgotten how to choose mercy because no one had ever shown him that mercy was a form of strength. She moved closer, and Theron did not draw away. His hand fell from his ribs, and she could see the armor there, still darkened with blood. "The arrow that was meant for you found me instead," Kyle said. She pressed her palm against the wound beneath his armor, feeling the poison still coiled there, still dangerous, but weakened. "And I walked into your fate and told your death that you were not finished yet, that a king who could be changed by an Omega's love was a king worth saving." "You should not have done that," Theron whispered, but his hand came up and covered hers, pressing her deeper into his wound, and she felt the last of the poison's resistance crumble beneath her touch. "No," she agreed, "but I did." In the ancient shelter, with the silver arrow lying in the snow outside, and the moon rising silver and patient above them, the Alpha King and the exiled Omega sat together in the darkness, and the threads of their destinies, once meant to never touch, began to braid into something neither of them could have woven alone. The hunters came 3 days later. Theron heard them first, the distant baying of hounds, the harsh calls of men who had learned to hunt in the high territories. His generals had finally realized he was missing, and they had sent their best to retrieve their dying king or confirm his death. Either way, the Empire would be served. Kyle was strong enough now to stand, though the wound in her chest still pulled tight when she moved. They had spent the days in careful conversation, not quite touching, not quite distant. The space between them was thick with everything that could not be spoken, the apologies he owed her, the forgiveness she could not quite grant, the bond that pulled at them both like the moon pulls the tide. "They will kill you if they find us together," Theron said. It was not a question. Both of them understood the politics that would be served by an Omega Pathfinder remaining alive, especially one who had already influenced a king toward mercy. "Yes," Kyle said. She stood at the shelter's entrance, watching the trees. "They will kill us both. But first, they will want answers." Theron's hand went to the hilt of a sword he no longer had. The generals had stripped him of weapons when they released him into exile. "Then, we run." "We cannot," Kyle said. Her Pathfinder's eyes had taken on that strange, distant quality they acquired when she was reading the threads of fate. "The territories are too vast, and your wound will open if you push it, and I am still weak from the fever. We would die in the snow before we reach the southern passes." "Then we fight," Theron said. It was a king's answer, automatic and impossible. Just the two of them against the hunters his own generals had sent. Suicide dressed up as defiance. But Kyle was shaking her head. "Then we tell them the truth," she said. The words hung between them like a held breath. Theron understood immediately what she was proposing, a revelation that would shatter everything, that would make it impossible for his generals to hide what they had done, what they had allowed. "They will claim you seduced me," Theron said, "that you used your gifts to cloud my mind. You will be burned as a sorcerer." "Perhaps," Kyle said. She turned to look at him, and in her eyes was something that looked like peace, or at least the acceptance of a terrible choice already made. "But you will have to deny it. You will have to stand in front of your court and say that you loved an Omega enough to exile yourself, and that your generals tried to kill her for seeing truth that made them uncomfortable. The story will be impossible to contain. They will have to answer for it." "And if I do not deny it?" Theron asked. "If I simply say it was true, that I did love you, that I do love you?" Kyle's breath caught. For a moment, the careful distance between them wavered, threatened to collapse entirely. "Then," she said slowly, "the Omega and the Alpha King will have chosen each other over the kingdom, and the kingdom will have to decide whether to accept that choice or burn itself down trying to prevent it." The hunters' calls were growing closer. Theron could smell their blood now, could taste the violence they carried like a scent. His wolf wanted to fight, but his human mind, the part of him that Kale had given back to him, understood that some battles could not be won with fangs and fury. Some battles could only be won by speaking truth. He took her hand, and the moment his skin touched hers, the silver arrow's mark on her chest seemed to pulse with light. A pathfinder's gift, recognizing its mate, the one soul it had chosen to walk alongside through whatever darkness lay ahead. "Then let us tell them," Theron said. And they walked out of the ancient shelter together, hand in hand, as the hunters emerged from the trees and the final judgment began. The general in charge was named Corsac, and he had the face of a man who had never questioned an order in his life. He stopped when he saw them emerge from the shelter together, when he saw the exiled Omega walking beside the Alpha King, as if she had every right to exist in his presence. For a moment, genuine confusion crossed his features, the kind that came from watching the world reorganize itself into an arrangement that violated every law he understood. "Your Majesty," Corsac said carefully, "you are wounded. We have come to bring you home for healing." "I have been healed," Theron replied. His voice carried the weight of kingship, but underneath it was something else. The steadiness of a man who had chosen something over his crown and found it did not destroy him to do so. "And I have been healed by the Omega you were ordered to kill." The hunters exchanged glances. Corsac's hand tightened on his sword. "The Omega is a pathfinder, Your Majesty, a sorcerer. We were ordered to—" "I know what you were ordered to do," Theron interrupted. "I gave the orders. And they were orders born from fear, not from justice. The fear of a man who had been taught that mercy was weakness, that an Omega who could see the truth of his actions was a threat to be eliminated." Kyle stood silent beside him, her hand still in his. The wound in her chest had stopped bleeding days ago, but the scar remained, silver bright in the weak winter sunlight, a permanent mark of the arrow meant for him. "The Omega spoke truth in my war councils," Theron continued. "The village we raised harbored enemies, yes, but it also harbored children, families, people who had nothing to do with the war but were burned because I chose to respond to violence with greater violence. She questioned that choice, and instead of listening, I destroyed her." "Your Majesty," Corsac said, and now his voice carried the tone of a man trying to speak to someone who had gone mad. "You are fevered. The wound has addled your mind. Let us bring you home. The healers will—" "I am not fevered," Theron said. "For the first time in my life, I am clear, and what I see is that I have been a king who was too afraid to be anything but cruel. So I am making a choice now, in front of you and your hunters. I am choosing mercy. I am choosing this Omega. And I am choosing to tell the truth of what we have done, what we have hidden, what we have burned away in the name of security." He squeezed Kale's hand gently, and she understood. This was the moment where everything would shatter. Kale stepped forward, and the silver light that had lived dormant in her chest since she had walked into Theron's fever began to pulse outward. Her Pathfinder's gift, no longer hidden, no longer contained. It rolled across the snow like moonlight made visible, and every hunter there felt it. The touch of a power that could read the architecture of their souls, that could see every choice they had ever made and every choice they would make. "I am a Pathfinder," Kyle said, her voice carrying harmonics that were not entirely human. "And I have read the threads of this kingdom's fate. I have seen the paths that lead from this moment forward. One leads to a throne built on ash and secrets, to a king who burns his own heart to keep his generals comfortable. The other leads to a throne built on truth, even if that truth burns." She turned to look at Theron, and her eyes were silver now, reading all the futures that hung in the balance. "But I have also seen that only the king can choose which path to walk. I cannot choose for him. My gift is to see, not to decide his destiny for him. That is his alone. Theron felt the weight of it, the terrible, exquisite weight of a choice that could not be undone. His generals had tried to make him a king who ruled through fear and silence. His Omega mate had given him back the possibility of being a king who ruled through truth. He chose. The kingdom burned with the truth for 6 months. Not with actual fire, though some of his generals threatened it, but with the kind of burning that comes from watching the carefully constructed lies of an empire begin to crack and crumble. The story spread. Alpha King Theron had chosen an exiled Omega over the crown's silence. He had revealed the atrocities his generals had committed in his name. He had refused to let the blood be hidden anymore. And the kingdom had to decide whether it could accept a king who bled like that, openly, honestly, without shame. Kale stood in the great hall where they had cast her out, and this time no one dared to strike her. Her scar had healed into something beautiful, a silver mark across her chest in the shape of an arrow, pointing toward her heart. Every wolf in the kingdom knew what it meant. She was marked by destiny, chosen by fate itself to stand beside the throne. The old courtiers who had demanded her death had fled or bowed or, in a few cases, asked for forgiveness. The generals had been replaced by wolves who could look at mercy without flinching. The war councils were quieter now, but no less fierce, just focused on rebuilding instead of destroying. Theron had paid a price for his choice. The poison from the arrow had left a permanent mark on his body. He would never be as strong as he had been, and his wolf had gained a quietness that would never leave him. Some of his strength had become hers, binding them together at a level deeper than bondmates. They were not quite one person, but they were not quite two anymore either. "Are you afraid?" Kyle asked him one night as they stood on the castle's highest tower, looking out at the territories they now ruled together. The silver arrow that had been meant to kill him had been forged into a crown, and it rested now in a vault beneath the castle, too dangerous to wear, but impossible to destroy. "Of what?" Theron asked. He took her hand, and the connection was immediate. Her pathfinder's gift meeting his wolf's instinct, creating something that was neither one nor the other, but a third thing entirely. Of losing this, of making a mistake, and having it burn everything again. Theron was quiet for a long moment. His wolf could feel the future threading out before them. Not certain, never certain, but possibility instead of fate. So much could still go wrong. Wars could come. Enemies could rise. The kingdom could decide that a king and Omega who had chosen love over power was a weakness that needed to be corrected. But there was also the possibility of something else. Of a kingdom built on truth instead of secrets, on mercy instead of fear, on the knowledge that strength and tenderness were not opposites, but partners in the dance of survival. "Yes," he said finally. "I am terrified, every moment. But I am more terrified of going back to the darkness. I am more terrified of being a king who silences the voices that could save him. So I choose this terror, day after day. I choose you." Kyle leaned her head against his chest, and she could feel his heart beating beneath her ear. Steady, human, no longer poisoned. The arrow's mark on her own chest pulsed gently in response, a rhythm that echoed his, creating something like a duet between two souls that had learned to sing in harmony. "My pathfinder gift showed me one more thread," she said softly. "Just one, in all the possible futures. A version where a king and an Omega, broken by the same cruelty, chose to rebuild each other instead. Where the kingdom learned that mercy was not weakness. Where love was not a liability, but a foundation." "That thread is this one?" Theron asked. "It is one possibility of this one," Kyle said. "We still have to choose it every day. But yes, this thread walks toward that future." Below them, the kingdom settled into sleep. Wolves howled in the distance, but these were songs of settlement, not hunting. The snow began to fall again, each flake a small blessing, covering the old marks and making space for new ones to be written. 5 years had passed since the day Kira knelt before the locket and chose to stay. 5 years of winters that grew gentler, of mountains that learned to shelter instead of devour, of a castle that had transformed from a fortress of conquest into something that had no name in the old languages, a sanctuary that belonged to no single pack, no single bloodline, but to everyone brave enough to believe in redemption. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. In the first year, Kira had nearly broken under the weight of teaching. There were 17 pathfinders that Alexander had released, each one carrying wounds that no silver light could fully heal. Some had been caged for decades. Some had been forced to birth children they'd never meet, their offspring taken to be raised as weapons. Some had forgotten their own names. Kira spent those months in a state of perpetual motion, moving between chambers, holding shaking hands, helping broken spirits remember what it meant to choose their own path. Luna, barely 12 years old, had worked beside her, the child's magic flowing through the castle like a lifeline, like proof that there was such a thing as grace. Theron had watched, and in watching, he'd changed. The king who'd searched mountains for 10 years had become something softer without losing his strength. He'd opened the castle's archives to the pathfinders, given them access to knowledge that had been hoarded by the nobility for centuries. He'd begun to dismantle the very structures that had made him powerful, and he'd done it without hesitation, without the resentment that usually accompanies such loss. By the 3rd year, the school had taken shape. Kira had written the curriculum herself, drawing on everything she'd learned in Exile, everything she'd discovered through the binding ritual. It wasn't just about controlling power. It was about understanding the philosophy beneath power, the ethics of a gift that could save lives or destroy them depending on the wielder's will. The other pathfinders became teachers too. Those who'd healed the fastest became mentors to those still breaking. Those who'd discovered new applications of the binding ritual, ways to share power across larger networks, to distribute magic without depleting any single vessel, had become pioneers of a new kind of magic entirely. Luna, at 13, had already surpassed her mentors in both power and wisdom. But it was her heart that distinguished her. She moved through the castle like water, flowing to whoever needed her most. She'd never known captivity, never known her gift as anything but beautiful, and that innocence, coupled with the knowledge of what Kira had sacrificed, had made her into something revolutionary. A pathfinder who believed in the gift not as a tool, but as a calling. The day everything shifted was in the 5th spring. The messenger had arrived at dawn, a young woman bearing the seal of the Northern Collective, the most conservative of the Pact territories. The message she carried was unprecedented, a formal request for a pathfinder to visit the Collective's capital, not to be enslaved, not to be studied, but to teach. Even Theron had been shocked. "They're afraid," Kira had explained, reading the careful words between the formal language. "The other territories are changing. The old hierarchy is fracturing. And the Northern Collective is terrified they'll be left behind, that their own Omegas will see what we've built here and revolt." "Let them be afraid," Luna had said. She was 15 now, silver-eyed and luminous, wearing the simple white robes of a pathfinder teacher. Fear is the first step toward understanding. And so Kira had gone. She'd spent 3 months in the Northern Territories, teaching their healers, meeting with their Alpha Council, showing them that a pathfinder's power didn't diminish a king's authority. It transformed it, made it into something worth respecting instead of merely obeying. When she'd returned, the castle had grown again. More refugees, more broken things seeking shelter, more hopeful faces in the corridors. It was on the anniversary of her arrival, precisely 5 years to the hour, that the wolf came. The snow was falling lightly, the kind of snow that felt like a blessing rather than a curse. Kira stood in the courtyard, watching the younger pathfinders practice their control. their silver light dancing across the frozen ground in patterns that would have seemed impossible 5 years ago. Each one was learning to hold their power without being consumed by it, to share their gifts without surrendering their will. The gates opened. Kira didn't look up immediately. She was too focused on correcting a young Omega's technique, showing her how to modulate the intensity of her light. But she felt the presence before she saw it. A wolf, large and silver-furred, moving with the careful deliberation of someone uncertain of their welcome. Behind the wolf, at the gates, stood the guards in conversation with it. No weapons drawn, no alarm raised. The wolf shifted at the center of the courtyard. The boy who emerged was 17, perhaps 18, young enough that his features still held the softness of adolescence, old enough that his frame promised the massive strength of an alpha king in the making. His eyes were the color of storm clouds, gray-blue and turbulent, and across his skin, visible even beneath his travel-worn clothes, Kira could see the marks of rank. The scarification that indicated he was an heir, trained, groomed for power. But there was something else in his expression, a hunger that had nothing to do with the body and everything to do with the spirit. "I'm looking for the Pathfinder Omega," he said to the guards, his voice rough from travel. "The one they call Kira. I was told she teaches here. I was told." He hesitated, and the hesitation revealed him. This was a boy who'd been taught never to hesitate, never to show uncertainty. The very act of searching for those words was a rebellion. "I was told there's a way to bond without breaking, a way to love without owning. And I need to know if that's true." The courtyard had gone silent. Every pathfinder had stopped their practice, their silver light dimming as they turned to look. Kira stood slowly, leaving the young woman she'd been teaching to her own devices. She walked across the frozen ground toward the boy, her footsteps making no sound despite the ice. When she was close enough to see the desperation in his eyes clearly, she stopped. "What's your name?" she asked. "Marcus," he replied. "Marcus of the Eastern Mountains. My father is—" "I know who your father is," Kira interrupted gently. "The Eastern Alpha King, the one who unified the 3 valleys 10 years ago. Very impressive." She tilted her head, studying him. "But that's not why you're here. An heir of the Eastern Mountains wouldn't travel alone, wouldn't arrive in wolf form at the gates of a sanctuary. You're here because something in your training broke, or something in your heart refused to break, and the two are at war." Marcus's jaw tightened. "My father has chosen my mate for me, an Omega from a neighboring pack, good breeding stock, a merger that will strengthen both territories. It's arranged, it's official, it's—" He swallowed hard. "It's everything I've been told to want, and it makes me feel like I'm drowning." He looked away, unable to meet her eyes. "I heard about this place. I heard that you teach bonding without hierarchy, that Omegas here choose their partners instead of being chosen for them, that an alpha can love without dominating. It seemed like a dream, a lie told to the desperate." He met her gaze again. "But I had to know. I had to come and see if it was real." Kira felt Theron's presence before she saw him. The king had come down from the library, drawn by the commotion, and now he stood at the edge of the courtyard. His eyes met hers across the frozen ground, a moment of understanding that needed no words. "It's real," Kira said simply, "but the reality is more complicated than you've been told. Bonding without hierarchy doesn't mean bonding without challenge. It doesn't mean your power becomes less. It means your power becomes a choice instead of a demand." She gestured for him to follow her. "Come, we have much to discuss." Over the next weeks, Marcus became part of the castle's rhythm. He was placed in training with the other young alphas who'd come seeking redemption, sons of kings who'd begun to question the old ways, warriors who'd seen too much blood spilled in the name of hierarchy. They trained together in the mornings, learning to fight without dominating, to assert strength without crushing. In the afternoons, they studied philosophy, history, the ethics of power. But what truly transformed Marcus was his time with the pathfinders. Kira had assigned him to work with Luna. The two of them were only a few years apart in age, but the difference in their maturity was vast. Luna had never known the world that Marcus came from. She'd been raised by a king and an Omega working as equals, had learned from birth that hierarchy was a choice, not an inevitability. She moved through the castle with a grace that made everything look effortless. And when she spoke, her words carried the weight of someone who'd been thinking deeply about the nature of power since childhood. She also had no patience for his self-pity. "You think your situation is unique?" she asked him one afternoon as they worked together in the healing chambers. A young pathfinder had come with a wound that required both of their powers to close, a deep laceration that had been infected for weeks. "You're an alpha prince uncomfortable with your role. That's almost a relief compared to what most of us have faced. My entire existence was written by someone else's choice. And I still chose to stay. I still chose to work. I still chose to become more than what was decided for me." She was right, and Marcus knew it. But knowing and accepting were different things. It took him 3 months. 3 months of watching Kira and Theron move through the castle together. Not as ruler and subject, not as master and servant, but as partners. They worked in the library together, sorting through the old texts. They walked the courtyards together, watching the training. They sat by the fire in the evenings, talking about the future, about the changes they wanted to see in the world. And sometimes, when they thought no one was watching, they'd simply hold each other in the darkness, finding comfort in the presence of someone who understood the cost of redemption. 3 months of watching Luna heal the broken pathfinders, pouring her power into their wounds, not because she was obligated, but because she chose to. Because she believed in redemption enough to work for it every single day. 3 months of learning, slowly, that power didn't have to be a cage. On the day Marcus decided to refuse his arranged mate, he came to find Kira in the library. "I'm not going back," he said. His voice was steady, but his hands were shaking. "I'm going to refuse the arrangement. I'm going to face my father and tell him that I want to choose differently. That I want to build something new in the Eastern Mountains, something based on partnership instead of hierarchy. And he's going to be furious. He's going to see it as weakness." "He will," Kira agreed. She set down her pen and looked at him fully. "And you'll have to decide if his approval matters more than your integrity. That's the real choice, Marcus. Not between two mates, but between the world you were taught to want and the world you're learning to believe in." "Will you help me?" he asked. "I don't know how to build something different. I've been trained my entire life to take, to command, to dominate. I don't know how to partner." Kira smiled. "None of us did. That's why we're here, to learn, to teach each other, to prove that a different way is possible." Marcus spent another year at the castle. He trained harder than anyone, pushing himself to the edge of exhaustion and beyond, determined to strip away the instincts he'd been taught were strength. He worked with Theron, learning how a king could hold authority while respecting the autonomy of others. He worked with Luna, learning how to receive power from others without trying to control or possess it. He worked with Kira, learning the philosophy that underlay the binding ritual, the understanding that true partnership required vulnerability. And slowly, almost without noticing it happening, he changed. When he finally returned to the Eastern Mountains, he didn't go alone. He went with 3 other young alphas and 4 pathfinders, all of them volunteers, all of them committed to helping him transform the territories. They established a small school on the border between the eastern and northern lands, a place where young alphas could learn what Marcus had learned, where pathfinders could teach what Kira had taught them. It was the beginning of a quiet revolution that would spread across the territories like dawn, gradual, inevitable, transforming everything it touched. By the 10th anniversary of Kira's arrival, the castle had become something that had never existed before in the Pact territories. It wasn't governed by a single king, though Theron still held wisdom and authority. It wasn't a pack in any traditional sense, though the bonds that held it together were stronger than blood. It was a network, a constellation of interconnected schools and sanctuaries, each one centered on the principle that power was meant to be shared, that hierarchy was a choice, that love could exist between equals. Pathfinders had become teachers across a dozen territories. Young alphas came seeking training, came seeking to understand that their strength didn't have to manifest as domination. Omegas came seeking freedom, seeking the knowledge that their submissiveness was a choice, not an essence. The old guard resisted, of course. There were territories that clung to the old ways, that saw the changes as corruption, as weakness. But even they couldn't deny what they saw when they looked at the borderlands where Kira's influence spread, the healings that came from pathfinders who worked without bitterness, the alphas who led without crushing, the communities where violence had decreased because people had learned to talk instead of fight. Theron had stepped back from his role as king by the 8th year. It wasn't a dramatic abdication. It was a gradual shifting, like seasons changing. He'd trained a council of younger leaders, both Alpha and Omega, both male and female, to make the decisions about the territory. He still attended their meetings, still offered wisdom when it was sought, but the day-to-day governance had passed to those with fresher visions and less attachment to the old ways. Now he spent most of his time in the library with Kira, writing their history. Not the version that would be told by official chroniclers, but the true version, the record of how two broken people had chosen each other, and how that choice had rippled outward until it transformed the world. Luna had become something between a priestess and a revolutionary. At 25, she held no official title, but her influence was felt everywhere. She traveled regularly between the schools, taught the most difficult students, and served as a living example of what was possible when a child was raised in freedom instead of hierarchy. She'd also never taken a mate, despite numerous proposals from young alphas seeking partnership. She'd explained it simply. My calling is larger than any individual bond. My love belongs to all of them, to everyone learning to love differently. Kira understood. She'd felt the same pull once, toward something larger than personal happiness. But she'd also learned, through Theron and Luna and the years of partnership, that love for one person and love for the many weren't in conflict. They could exist simultaneously, each deepening the other. The locket still hung around Theron's neck. Inside, it still held that first breath, Luna's first breath, preserved in crystal, the moment that had changed everything. But it had changed, too. The silver had darkened slightly from years of being worn against his skin, absorbing the essence of his heartbeat. And sometimes, when the light hit it just right, you could see other images in the crystal, moments of transformation, frozen like photographs. The moment Kira had fallen into the snow, the moment she'd chosen to stay, the moment Marcus had decided to refuse his cage, all of their moments preserved together. It was on an evening in late autumn, 10 years and a few months after Kira's arrival, that they gathered in the courtyard one last time to mark the anniversary properly. The entire castle came. Pathfinders and alphas, healers and warriors, the lost and the found. They stood in a great circle under the silver moon, and one by one they spoke about what this place had meant to them, what Kira and Theron and Luna had taught them. A young pathfinder spoke about choosing to stay instead of fleeing. An alpha prince spoke about discovering that strength and gentleness could coexist. A refugee who'd been broken by captivity spoke about learning to trust again. An old healer spoke about finding purpose in teaching instead of hoarding. When it was Kira's turn to speak, she found herself overwhelmed by an emotion she couldn't quite name. Not grief, though it was familiar with grief. Not joy, though there was joy in it. Something larger. Something like the feeling of snow falling, each flake individual and unique, but together creating something that covered the whole world. When I fell into the snow 10 years ago, Kira began, her voice carrying across the silent courtyard, I expected to die. I thought I was giving everything, my life, my power, my future, to save one child, and I was at peace with that. There are worse things to die for than hope. She looked at Theron, at Luna, at all the faces that had become family in these years. But I didn't die. Instead, I found something I didn't know I was searching for. I found a king who didn't need to dominate to lead. I found a child who proved that mercy and power could be the same thing. I found a place where Omega didn't mean less, where Alpha didn't mean master, where the old rules could be rewritten by anyone brave enough to imagine something different. She paused, and in that pause, the whole castle seemed to hold its breath. And more than that, she continued softly, I found that the sacrifice I made in that moment, pouring my life into a child's lungs, didn't diminish me. It connected me. It made me part of something larger than myself. Every time I've taught since then, every time I've helped someone remember that they could choose differently, I've been participating in a kind of resurrection, my own and everyone's. She turned to Theron. You spent 10 years searching for me. But the truth is, I spent the same 10 years searching for you. We just didn't know it until we found each other. Theron stood and took her hand. In the silver light, they looked like something out of legend. The king with the locket still glowing faintly around his neck, the pathfinder with her eyes reflecting the moon, both of them marked by scars that had become strength. I searched because I thought I owed you a debt, Theron said, his voice rough with emotion. I thought I was looking for a savior to thank, but I found instead a partner to learn from. A woman who taught me that a king could be more powerful by sharing power than by hoarding it, who taught me that love didn't diminish authority, it transformed it into something worth having. He lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. Thank you for choosing to stay. Thank you for making it possible to choose, Kira replied. Luna joined them, and the three of them stood together in the center of the circle, the child and the king and the Omiag who'd reshaped the world. The silver light that emanated from them intensified, drawing power from everyone watching, from every bond that had been formed in this place, from every heart that had learned to love differently. It was Luna who spoke the blessing, in the old tongue of the pathfinders, words so ancient that few still understood them, but everyone could feel their meaning in their bones. By the blood that binds us, by the choices we've made, by the ice that tested us, and the fire that transformed us, let this circle remain eternal. Let those who come after us remember that love is not a weakness, but the greatest strength. That partnership is not a compromise, but a revolution. That every soul has the right to choose their own destiny and the right to stand as equal to those they love. When the blessing ended, the sky above them seemed to shift. The snow that fell was different somehow, warmer, kinder, more merciful than snow had any right to be. And in the castle, and in the territories beyond, in the schools that carried Kira's teaching, in the hearts of every person who'd learned that they could choose differently, the story continued. Not the old story, the one about kings and conquests, about hierarchy and domination, but a new story. A story about redemption and partnership, about broken things learning to mend each other. A story about an Omega who'd given her last breath to save an Alpha's child, and who'd discovered in the years that followed that she'd been saving herself all along. That sometimes the greatest rescue isn't from an external threat, but from the cage of everything we've been told we have to be. Theron kept the locket close until the end of his days, 50 years later, when he finally felt the mountains calling him home, when his body had become too tired for the work of leadership. Kira was with him when he died, her silver light surrounding his form, making sure his passage was gentle. She took the locket from his neck and added her own essence to it, not replacing his, but joining with it, so that future generations could look at that crystalline vessel and see the love that had remade the world. Luna inherited the locket. She kept it in the temple, where it became a symbol of everything the Moonblood Chronicles had taught, that love is a choice, that power is meant to be shared, that every soul is worth saving. And the snow continued to fall on the mountains, And the wolves continued to sing under the moon. And somewhere in every frozen dark, other dying Omegas and broken kings learned the truth that Kira had lived. That redemption isn't something that happens to you. It's something you choose, moment by moment, day by day, standing beside someone else who's chosen it too. If your heart beat alongside ours, like, comment, and subscribe. Because every soul that joins our moon keeps the flame of redemption alive. This is Moonblood Chronicles, where rejection becomes destiny, and love is the most dangerous magic of all. The story doesn't end. It transforms.